What do you do if a client refuses to pay you for the work that you've done? And how often do we as artists take on new clients, we do the work, and we never get paid? A lot of us get to that point where we're screwed, we get jaded, and we think that the art industry isn't stable, and we blame the industry itself rather than the client, rather than taking responsibility and treating our business as a business. There is so much you can do before the project starts to protect yourself, while the project's going on, and even after the project's finished, to make sure that you get paid on time and you're respected throughout the entire process. It's really up to you whether you want to treat your business as a business, or if you prefer some great stories about how you struggle as an artist and how tough it is to be an artist. It's your call. After 25 years in the creative industry, I want to share some advice from myself, from my lawyers, and from colleagues on how to protect yourself and how to get paid by your clients. But first of all, I just want you to remember it's a business. You fulfilled your part of the work and they need to fulfill theirs, which is paying you on time. I'm going to outline everything that you need to know on this subject. I also got my lawyers involved in this as well. First, a quick word from my sponsor, Skillshare. Their support and yours is what made this video possible. So please take 60 seconds to watch this and take advantage of their free membership in the link below. Thank you. So before we get started, I want to mention something that I think is really important for all of us as we move into 2020. After all, the point of this YouTube channel is to help creatives level up their skills and their career and give you the tool set to excel in the creative industry. That's why I've teamed up with Skillshare to give you access to their platform, and I think it's really critical for us to focus this year on growth and expanding our skills as we move through 2020. And the best way to do that is to have access to the appropriate information when we need it. With Skillshare, you can learn Houdini, Maya, After Effects, you could learn to code in Python. There are limitless courses on all your favorite topics, instantly accessible when you need them. The best part is that you can get 2 free months of premium membership right now by clicking the link below this video to get instant access. And then you can start your journey to learning new skills that you can use to be more confident in your day-to-day work, as well as open up doors to new opportunities for a brighter future. I personally love the classes on DSLR photography, as well as the classes on Python programming as well. But there are countless other courses which make it really fun to have a morning routine to sit down and watch a class on your phone or your laptop on your commute to work or on your lunch break as well. I want you to make 2020 your year to learn new skills, level up your creativity, and have the knowledge you need to make this a pivotal year to look back on, where everything changed and you never looked back. So if this sounds good, sign up with the link below this video and level up your skills today. Okay, as you go through this video, make sure to leave any comments about questions, ideas, or thoughts that you want to share as well. And thank you for subscribing if you want to get more videos on this topic and others. I make it my life's work to help other artists level up their career and get the success that they deserve. So, diving into this, how do you get paid by your clients? What do you do if they refuse to pay? I want to talk about a few key subjects here. One is preempting the chaos and protecting yourself ahead of time. In other words, do your due diligence. Don't just take on every client job and expect that they're all going to work out great. I tend to interview my clients more than they interview me, because I really want to get an idea about how chaotic the project's going to be, how organized they are, how shifty they might be. So this is something that you need to take into consideration. Do your research, whether it is just Googling them or whether it is going on LinkedIn and even seeing what other mutual connections you might have. Maybe you've got some friends who've worked for that company before or that client, and that might be a good indicator if you ask them what their experience was like. If they say, it took me 6 months to get paid, that's a red alert right there. That's a red flag saying don't do it, or at least be prepared that you're going to run into some kind of difficulty getting paid. So in other words, ask around and get a vibe for what they're like in the first place. Another thing is it's great to do this anyway to better understand what they're like to work with, and it's also great to know what commonalities you might have. In other words, if you find out that there are friends or colleagues of yours that have worked with them, then it's good to be able to communicate that, like, oh yeah, so-and-so worked with your company as well. Yeah, we're good friends, blah, blah, blah. In other words, having rapport, commonalities, that sort of thing, it's good in general anyway. But more importantly, it's good to do your groundwork. Understand whether or not they're shifty in the first place. Also, trust your gut. If your spidey senses are tingling, trust that maybe that's for a reason. When you ask a lot of questions and they're kind of dodging a lot of them, or especially when you bring up money, they're kind of vague about the whole thing, that's a good indicator that maybe you should trust your instincts about this client that they mightn't be all that on board as you might think. One thing I do want to bring up though, and this is really important, is to bring up money fairly early on into the conversation. I feel like a lot of us are really afraid to do this because we're afraid that somehow we're going to lose the client, they're going to be upset with us, or some other weird thing is going to go on. And because of that, we don't tend to actually bring up money. We figure, oh, well, once I get to talk about the project a bit more, I'll do it then. And then you start to do the work. You're like, oh, well, I'll bring it up later. Then towards the end of the project, you figure, well, I'll send them an invoice at the end. This is a recipe for disaster, and it's one that's very common. I've been there, a lot of my friends have been there, and it's typically the thing where if you don't bring up money and you don't lock down the details very early on, there can be a lot of misunderstandings, and sometimes it isn't that they're legitimately trying to screw you over, it's just you never brought it up. And that's when later they could say, well, I thought this was for exposure or 100 other things. Or they bring up money and they're thinking they're going to pay you $100, you're expecting 1,000. And either way, it breaks down the communication, but it also then breaks down the relationship because at that point there's bad blood. You get annoyed with them, there's a lot of discomfort, they don't want to work with you because they feel guilty. And because of that, a great opportunity, a great relationship ends up going down the drain. Now, in other cases, they might actually intentionally want to screw you, and that's a whole other thing. But keep in mind that either way, this is a business. If they're making money, you should be making money as well. And in general, this is something where you should be bringing up the circumstances of how you're going to work, the conditions, everything else ahead of time. So that way you're all on board, you can square that all away, and you can just focus on doing the work and focus on building the best experience you can be with that client. So keep that in mind. Bring up money, bring up all the details ahead of time. No one likes to talk about money. They're not secretly hoping that they get a chance to squash you. They're just uncomfortable as well. But this is important for you to move forward, that you're all on board, you're all in agreement, you're all on the same page, and there's no misunderstandings as you move forward with doing the work. And the worst thing is that sometimes you might start to build up resentment or secretly be afraid like, I don't even know how much I'm being paid, and you start getting jaded. There's so many bad things that can happen as an artist from just not talking up front about, hey, by the way, what's the budget for this project? Or how much money do you have in mind for this? Whatever it might be, however you want to bring it up. I've got plenty of videos on my channel on YouTube covering this as well as in the podcast as well. Another key thing is to have it all in writing. In other words, make sure that you have it all in the contract. If you can't do that, then at least have email as a bread trail between you and the client. In other words, make sure that everything is documented somewhere so that way you have proof that they have intent to pay, that you've done the work, that they're satisfied with the work, you've delivered it, and they haven't delivered on what they promised. So I bring this up because, again, a contract is binding, but if you haven't gone through the steps of doing that, email is still something that you can show to your lawyers and that they can actually use as well. So the more evidence you have, the better. Phone calls are illegal without their permission, especially in some states in the US, it's highly illegal. So keep that in mind that you can't record a conversation and say, well, here's a recording of them telling me they're going to pay me thousands of dollars, but you can do it all via email. So I still think that it's better to have discussions on the phone because communication is crystal clear that way. But what I tend to do is I'll always follow up with a quick email afterwards. So in other words, you might get on the phone, have a conversation with them. And again, by being on the phone, you get a better understanding about how shifty they might be or whether you have that bad gut feeling. But usually, or hopefully, these are all going to be positive conversations. But after you finish the phone call, just simply follow up and say, hey, thanks so much for the quick chat. I'm really excited about this project. Just to confirm, we're going to start on this date and deliver on this date. As we mentioned on the call, this is going to pay $5,000. 50% up front and then 50% upon delivery. If all that sounds good to you, shoot me back a response and let me know, and then I can get started. Looking forward to your response. Again, for me, I always say looking forward to your response or something like that because I'm putting a lot of emphasis on the fact that they need to respond before I start the work. And that way I can quickly follow up again and say, hey, just quickly following up about my last email. If you can just get back to me and let me know if all of this is correct. If so, then I can proceed with starting to work on everything. Really excited to get working on this project. I think it's going to be so much fun. Thanks again. If you can quickly respond and just let me know that this is correct. whatever it might be. So the importance of that is just quickly following up with all the details that were discussed on the call, reiterating them over email, getting them to confirm. You firing out a blank email saying, hey, by the way, it was great that we agreed to $1 million, and they don't reply confirming that, doesn't really hold up as well. So you want them to reply before you start working in the first place. I still think doing a contract is the best thing to do. And once you standardize a contract, you can use it over and over and over. I don't recommend just downloading one off the internet because typically they're not exactly up to par with your exact conditions or your exact circumstances. It's better to hire a lawyer, pay him $350 or whatever it might be, have a contract drafted that you can use all the time. It's worth it in the long run, and it's worthwhile to protect yourself. Either way, get them to say yes to everything. Confirm it all so that way it's locked in. The other thing is locking in payment details. Don't just assume because you agreed to get paid that everything's going to go smoothly. I tend to work on a lot more higher profile projects, so it's not uncommon to have a paycheck waiting for $200,000, $500,000, $700,000. I've signed a few contracts that were over $1 million, and it's really cool to have like big high profile projects and big budgets behind them. The downside is that typically I have other employees and other costs involved. And if I don't get paid, I get screwed because I want to make sure that I'm not reciprocating what's going on. In other words, if I get screwed, I'm not going to screw my employees. So it means that I pay them and then I'm stuck in the middle, not being paid by my client and having to figure all that out. And it gets very tricky very quickly. So one story is a very big Super Bowl commercial that I worked on. This project was more around the $250,000 mark. And when I did the project, we'd initially discussed all the milestone payments, which I'm going to get into in a moment. And that was 25% upfront, and then I think it was 25% halfway through, then 50% upon delivery. So in other words, $125,000. Now, the problem is that I'd agreed on dates for the first two, and then the last one was upon delivery. What ended up happening is that the first two went through a clockwork or got paid exactly as we'd agreed in the contract. The last one, however, I didn't hear anything from them, and I had to follow up multiple times, and they just kept saying that they're just waiting for payment from their client, which was Sony, and then they'll be able to pay me. So later on, they came back with this net 90, which I'd never heard of in my life. Very familiar with net 30, but to have a 3-month turnaround to get paid once they'd been paid by their client, it ended up being about 4 or 5 months to get paid. Now, that put me in a really tricky situation, knowing that I'd been paid on time up until then. I'd burned out the last of our funds thinking, hey, we've got some extra money. Why don't I buy some extra computers for the project so that way we can finish rendering and really turn up the detail and make it the best it can be. Suddenly I'm left with no bank account and waiting months and months and months to actually get paid in the first place. And this was a really tricky time. My now wife, I actually had to borrow money from my friends. And this isn't that long ago. This was about 10 years ago. So I had to actually borrow money from my friends just to be able to go out on a date with her when I first met her. It was really embarrassing to be in that situation, one that I never want to repeat, but it was also a valuable lesson that every single date needs to be set up and there needs to be circumstances involved or repercussions if they're not paying on time. So I don't care that their client isn't paying. They should bring that up when they're signing the contract that, hey, just FYI, little discrepancy with this one. We can't pay you till the client pays us. And that way I might end up setting up multiple milestone payments. So 25% upon delivery, 25% when your client pays you. So that way it's less than I would have to deal with otherwise. So whatever it might be, you need to figure out what red flags come up or set up repercussions if they're not actually following through with what you agreed with contractually. So assume nothing and don't be afraid to talk about the details in the first place. And as I mentioned before, doing milestone payments is really common. So it's not uncommon to say, I want 50% up front and then 25% halfway through, then 25% upon delivery, whatever the split you decide on. And so for bigger projects that are quick turnaround, I'm guilty in the past of instead saying, oh, I'll just invoice you at the end. And the problem is when it is, let's say, 50K or 100K, it's a lot more difficult for them to scrounge together the funds, whereas it would have been easier for them to continue to pay you out as you go. I actually have checks sitting on my desk which are expiring in about 3 days that I need to actually cash still, and I'm really notoriously bad for doing that at times. But because there have been difficulties with paying me because the amount is so high, it's something that I've started to change over time, not only to avoid any catastrophe, but also just to make it easier on them. There's one story that comes to mind. One of my friends, he's a producer for New Line Cinema. They produced the first Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and they had an employee at Weta who was quite well off and never actually invoiced the entire time he was on the project, which was, I think, 3 years. And so when he finally invoiced at the very end, it was for hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was something ridiculous. I forget the exact number, but it wasn't like 100 or two. It was somewhere in the middle of 6 and 7 figures. So in other words, for them, it was a huge disruption to accounting because they thought they were actually in a good position to be in until they found out they actually owed a lot of money to this one individual. Sometimes it can actually screw things up and make things more difficult by holding off invoicing rather than doing smaller withdrawals as you go. So either way, keep in mind that you can do a multiple split payment plan throughout the project, so that way you're being paid some up front, being paid more down the line, and then you're being paid some upon final delivery of whatever you agree upon as the deliverables. This also means that worst case scenario, if you were screwed, that maybe it's $2,000 rather than $10,000 or something like that. So in other words, you're lessening the blow, but you're also encouraging them to pay you, because if it's less money, they're more likely to be like, oh, $2,000 isn't much. $10,000 might be for them. So it's more about making it easier for everybody. And it sounds stupid that you would need to do that, but again, to avoid those situations that you might fall in, these are the ways to set yourself up for success rather than failure. So if a client is ever late on making a payment, you don't need to be difficult or freak out or be standoffish. That's probably the worst thing you can do. You can just gradually say, hey, I haven't received payment. I need it by this Friday to continue working on this project. This is just a friendly reminder, or whatever you want to say. So there's multiple different ways to handle it, but I'm not going to be standoffish in the beginning. They're going to escalate very quickly because, again, I'm not going to be their best friend a month from now either. But initially, the first time around, it's just going to be a friendly reminder saying, hey, just a quick heads up that I haven't received payment. I need payment by this Friday to continue work on this project. If you can let me know right away that you can make payment by Friday, that would be really great. Thanks so much. But if you don't hear any response, that's when you can follow up and be a little bit more sharp and give them a quicker turnaround to pay you. I've only once had to stop working on something, and that lasted for about an hour. So I think this was on Destiny. I was doing something with Bungie. The client wasn't Bungie, but what I did is I hadn't been paid for the past couple of weeks when I'd given them invoices. So I just said, unfortunately, as of later today, like this will be the last day I'm on the project until I receive payment. And within an hour, they had that all resolved. Typically, they're not trying to screw you over. A lot of clients are just purely bad at managing everything going on, and they might have made you a lower priority paying you over managing the rest of the project. If you see my cat walking around, it's on my desk right now. But keep that in mind, that they're not the enemy necessarily until they become the enemy. But don't be a pushover. Make sure you point that out, that I need to get paid to continue working on this, because again, this is a business and needs to be taken seriously, and it also needs to be something that they need to take you seriously with the work that you're performing, as well as making sure that you're paid and everything that you agreed upon is being fulfilled. Okay, so there's my cat. Discuss money up front. Okay, so always mention upon final payment that you'll deliver the final files, or let's say maybe you watermarked them, so that way you'll remove the watermark and deliver the final content once you've received final payment. There are multiple ways to protect yourself. Good kitty. There are multiple ways that you can protect yourself. Okay, this is getting ridiculous. Just keep that in mind. There are multiple ways to protect yourself, and you don't need to go to the most extreme, but at the same time, figure out what you're comfortable with and ways that you will be able to retain ownership of the content until you receive that final payment. And that way, it's just incentive for them that they know that they've got what they need. They just need to hand over the final payment, and then they'll receive the final content that they can work with, whether it's raw files, whether it is just non-watermarked content, whatever it could be. So that's always a best case practice, so that way it's incentive for them. There is going to be some really tricky situations where you do design work and then you get to a point where they've got it, then they go to someone cheaper with your stuff and they recreate it from scratch. There's lots of shady stuff out there, but don't assume that you're going to get screwed over from day one. But use common sense in ways that you can go about doing what you need to make sure you're getting paid the maximum amount that you can and you're protected the entire way through. So as I mentioned before, if you're doing milestone payments, then at least it's lowering the blow. If they owe you $20,000, but they've been paying you along the way, 5% of $20,000 that you still are owed isn't as bad as being owed 100% of that $20,000. So just keep that in mind too, that at least that way you're kind of setting it up where they're less likely to screw you over. And on top of that, you're not out with... there is one project I did a long time ago. I was 21 years old and I had flown to the US to lead a big game cinematic project. I did all the work and I was only owed, I think, $1,200 in the end. And they ended up screwing me for a year on that, promising me that they would pay me, that they would take care of it all. And they kept giving me all these stories about how quiet it is at the studio. Meanwhile, I'm talking to other people at the studio. They're telling me how busy they are. And it was just me getting the runaround the whole time. Me being 21, I was a bit more naive to this. And I was just very patient about it. Eventually, I decided to do something which... for my own satisfactory I did, which was I emailed them and said, okay, I'll let you guys keep the money. If you just acknowledge that you're stealing from me, then we'll call it even. And naturally, I never heard from them again until I moved to the States about 6 months later. And then their receptionist called me saying, hey, Michael heard you're back in town and we really need you on a project right now. Check your bank account. He just paid you and we're wondering if you're available to start work tomorrow. Naturally, I didn't take the job. But that's the kind of stuff that younger me would do. I would be a pushover, trying to be likable and friendly to everyone. And at the same time, like, if it was a lot more money, then maybe I'd have to get a lawyer and get everyone else involved in that. At the time, I just figured, you know what, I'm just going to count it as a loss and move on. And it sucks to be in that situation. These days, I wouldn't have been in that situation in the first place because, again, your spidey senses. I would have checked my gut and noticed that these guys are really shady. Now they're out of business, but they're really shady at the time. And that's something that I would have just avoided working for them in the beginning. Or the minute that they were late on paying me, I would have stopped working altogether. So either way, I think that there's a lot that you can do along the way before you ever get to the point where it is a complete screw over. You can start to detect that things are starting to get shady, and you can start to take action at that point to protect yourself from future stuff happening. By the way, leave a comment and let me know what you think of this, like what thoughts you have. Like maybe there's some things that you do that have worked really well for you to protect yourself from ever getting screwed over by your clients. I'd love to hear them, and I'm sure everyone else would as well. But as I mentioned before, I only work with clients who I get a good vibe from. Not all of us can be in this situation. Obviously, if we're dying to get work and we'll do whatever it takes, then we don't have the luxury of turning away clients. But at the same time, it is your fault if you think that there's something really wrong with these people and I don't trust them, but I'm going to go work for them, then you might as well consider that free work. You're better off holding off and making yourself available for someone else, or just telling them what I mentioned before. Set up milestones, set up something on good faith that you are going to be paid on time. Again, it's a business. How can you do the work if you don't have a home to go to, because you don't have electricity, you didn't pay your rent, any of these things? We all have expenses, and it's only fair that you get compensated for the work that you've done. So as I mentioned before, if I don't receive payment after all this, then I'll quickly just send a reminder. I'll say, hey, this is just a quick reminder. Sent an invoice 2 weeks ago. Do you have any indication when I'll get paid for that? I'm just following up on my last email. I'm a bit concerned as I haven't received a response. I need confirmation that A, you've received it, and B, when you're able to make payment. So please get back to me by end of day today. Again, giving time constraints is important. You're not making threats, but you're saying I need to know by the end of today. At that point, again, like I'm not going to send my first email saying you need to get back to me by the end of today. But if they haven't replied to my first email, then that's when I'm going to be a bit more concerned. I'm going to give it a bit more urgency. At that point, you can escalate things even more. You can say, in regards to my final invoice, I still haven't received word from you or payment. You could continue from there. You could say, I'm sure neither of us want to have to deal with a lawsuit, and so I need to hear back from you within the next 48 hours. Otherwise, further communication will be with my lawyer. Here's my number. Please call me ASAP. And of course, if they do call, I wouldn't have the call without getting express permission from them on the phone call that you're able to record the conversation too. Because again, at that point, whatever they're saying, that's something that I would probably want to have handy to give to my lawyer if they were going to, screw me in some kind of way. So again, you can't record people's phone calls without their permission. But if you say, hey, just FYI, I'm going to record this phone call. Do I have your permission? I just want to make sure that this is covered because I'm a bit concerned about the situation we're now in. And if they aren't cool with it, then you can say, well, unfortunately, I don't want to have this conversation with you without my lawyer present as well, or via email, whatever it might be. Again, you don't want to be in these situations, but these are the ways that I would handle it, where you're not being extremely difficult, but at the same time, you're being very direct. You're saying that this is escalated, and the reason that we're having this conversation, the way that we're having this conversation, is because you're not being paid for the work that you've performed for them. You've done your end of the bargain, or you've done your end of the contract. They haven't done theirs. There have been situations where, let's say, a big studio in LA wanted to hire me for a project, but their New York studio owed me $100,000. And I've had to tell them that I can't work with them until their New York office pays me. So those are the times where sometimes internally things get resolved, because suddenly the head of one studio can go to the CEO and say, hey, this other studio is screwing up our relationship with this person, and because of that, we can't get any work done. We need that resolved right away. And that has happened a couple times where that's been resolved because internally now someone's willing to bat for you, so that way they can get you on their team and go about doing what they need to do. And sometimes that actually worked out really well, where in the future I always got paid on time. The CEO spoke to the accountant and always made sure I was a priority above everyone else. So sometimes a little bit of chaos can actually work in your favor long term. Actually, one funny story, mostly because it's about someone, a compositor in Australia, who is a very quiet guy in general. He's just more of an introvert more than anything. So it's just funny coming from him. But he had done some work for a studio in Sydney. This is going back like 20-something years. But the studio hadn't actually paid him for the work that he had done. Finally, it got to a point where he called him up and he's like, hey, I would really love to go staff at your studio. I'd love to go full-time and work with you guys. And the owner of the studio was over the moon. He's like, oh, wow, that would be so cool. He went to the owner of the studio and actually said, I would love to go staff at your studio. And the owner got really excited, like, wow, like this guy was actually a big deal. So they loved the idea of being able to bring him on board. Now, at that point, he said, oh, by the way, just one quick thing. You guys owe me about, like, I think it was like $15,000, something like that. And they're like, oh, okay, no problem. We'll get that taken care of right away. So the owner of the studio called him up later that day. And he's like, hey, just to let you know, we took care of the payment. That's all taken care of. Anyway, so when do you want to start? And there was silence on the phone for a moment. And then this guy, Tim, he's like, F you. And just kind of just dropped an F-bomb on him. It's just like, F you. And that was it. And again, just coming from someone who's so quiet, just so kind of like, reserved, it's just funny kind of hearing it from him. But the way that the story was told to me is that there was just like this long silence on the phone, and then the owner just like hung up the phone, and I called him back an hour later, like, hey, we got disconnected, so when can you start working for me? And to me, I always thought that was funny to kind of go to that extreme, but it was also something that resonated with me too, the fact that he had kind of built out that strategy. Now, not all of us are in that higher demand that we can call up the owner of a studio and kind of barter saying, hey, I want to work at your company full time and have them bend over backwards to make you happy. But it does mean that there are times you can kind of like figure out ways to get paid through quid pro quo or whatever. So in other words, getting them to pay you because it's in their best interest. And there are going to be those situations from time to time. But again, I'm always going to look at what tools do I have at my disposal. If they do want a good relationship with me or with someone that I know, then maybe that's something that they're going to start to think about, how they can actually treat me better because their reputation's now on the line. Now, as I mentioned before, a contract is so critical as well. I still think that having a contract to get paid is the best way to go. And that means that you've got to get one drafted up. So, like I said, you can download some off the internet. There's also websites like Rocket Lawyer, a few other ones around. I have a podcast episode coming out with Seth Polanski, who is an intellectual property lawyer who specifically focuses on working with artists. He is the man. It was so cool to connect with him, where we've got many mutual friends. He also helped me out with a friend of mine who had a celebrity client. So I've actually got a podcast episode coming out. It's interviewing Seth Polanski. He's an intellectual property lawyer who focuses specifically on creatives, so other artists like you and I. And I think that this episode is so brilliant. There's so much value in this episode that I highly recommend checking it out. I think it's coming out February 15, if I recall correctly. It's episode 235 of the Allan McKay podcast. So if you want to check that out, I'll definitely link to my podcast in the show notes down below this in the description. But it should be coming out not long from now. So there's a lot of value given there. But one of the things that we talked about, which is so valuable, is actually more to do with setting up restraints around the contract. So pay me within a certain amount of time, but also setting up repercussions if they don't do it. So one of the things we discuss is setting terms in your contract. So one of the things I mentioned earlier was net 30. So in other words, this is pretty common, submitting an invoice saying that it needs to be paid within 30 days. Now, that's something that generally gets ignored because what's going to happen? You didn't set any other terms around it. You didn't set any repercussions like, if I don't pay you, what's going to happen? It's quite elusive because you're saying you have to do this by this date, but you don't actually say what's going to happen otherwise. So one of the key things that this shouldn't be just on your invoice, it should be in the contract that they sign. Otherwise, again, like you're firing out something that they never agreed to, you can kind of ignore it. But having it in your contract saying, I want to have net 30 on all my invoices that I send in, that they need to be paid in full within 30 days. And if they aren't paid, then interest is occurring daily from the first day of late payment, as well as having a late payment penalty. So those two things alone means that if they don't pay you, then there's going to be an exponential cost involved for every day that they're not paying you. So 6 months late on paying, that could have tripled or quadrupled the amount that they owe you. So again, this is taking steps that when it's time to escalate, and hopefully you don't get to that point, but if you do, then you've got every right, because they signed the contract, you've got every right to be able to get 4x the amount of it. The other thing is recovery costs. So keeping in mind that hiring a lawyer and chasing them down, all of the time spent having to follow up with them, everything else involved with it, you can then get that money back. In other words, they're going to be paying for the lawyer and everything else involved for you to get back the money that you're owed. So again, you can't just put this on your invoice, which is what a lot of people do. They say, I've got this really cool trick, and they're so proud of themselves that they say that interest occurs if you don't make payment on time. Your invoice doesn't mean anything. There's nothing signed there. They didn't agree to it. They could have, for all you know, never even read that at all. The accountant saw it and, squared it away. But if you put in a contract that they need to sign before you do the work, that means that you're completely in your rights to be able to redeem all the costs involved, as well as all the penalties, the interest, everything else, because they weren't paying you on time. And like I said, you don't want to get to that situation where you have to escalate, but if you do, at least you're not chasing up a $5,000 cost by paying $10,000 of lawyer fees or something ridiculous like that. So Seth Polanski, the lawyer I just mentioned who's on the podcast, one thing he mentioned, which I thought was so brilliant, was that one of his clients was a musician. He was hired to score out a TV commercial. So in other words, to do the music for a TV commercial. And part of that was that he had gotten them to sign a contract saying to do all the things I had mentioned. But one of the other things was that he retained ownership of the music until he receives final payment. Now, that one little line in there meant that when they screwed him, they didn't pay him for the money that they owed him. He actually retained copyrighted ownership over the music that they were then illegally using in their commercial. So this commercial went on to TV, it went on the radio, it went out everywhere. And because of that, he was able to sue them for a much more substantial amount of money, because they were now infringing copyright of his property, of his music. And that meant that he got payment big time. So that's something to keep in mind too, that the more that you cover your butt, hopefully you never have to use any of these things, but at least they're there in case those situations ever occur. Another thing I just want to quickly mention is that suing companies that are in other countries, it's very difficult to be able to chase that down. You're going to have to hire a lawyer in their local country, and of course, all the agreements that you might have taken place over there won't necessarily hold up. So in other words, that's why a lot of companies, if they're setting up studios in another country, they're going to be hiring lawyers specifically for that country, so that way everything plays out that way. So again, when you're dealing with international clients, things get complicated very quickly, and it's just more reason why you should be pretty careful about all this. Even in the US, like if you were working for a different state, then if you were to sue them, you're either need to have to hire a lawyer and sign an affidavit so that way they can go and sue the person for you in that state, or you're going to be flying over there to that state to go through all of the troubles that you're doing. These are just things to keep in mind. Like ideally, you never want to have to sue anyone, but if it gets to that point that you are in that situation, you need to at least have covered your butt. Otherwise, you're going to be in that situation where they owe you all this money and you don't have a leg to stand on because you did all of your negotiating over the phone. There's no bread trails, there's no contract signed, there's no terms or anything set up. All of these things are a big lesson that you're going to learn the hard way. The other downside of suing people is that it's not only risky, but it also makes you a liability as well. So in other words, you don't want to get a reputation for suing employers because it means that you're a risk to bring on. And I've been in a situation where I've got friends who have wanted to hire and they've sued other people before for wrongful dismissal or other reasons. And because of that, it means that if I were to hire them, like, does that mean that they might sue me? And I've seen some people actually sue companies for no good reason at all. Most people don't know the full story about whether or not you're this lawsuit happy person who sues everybody or whether or not there was good reason behind it. But either way, when you've got two people you can hire, one of them has sued the employer that they last worked for, the other one hasn't, it makes you more favor the person who's less risk to hire. And that's the downside when you're going through this, that there's a chance that you are going to be tainted. Your reputation is going to be tainted by standing up for yourself. And this is really where things get murky and dirty, is the fact that all you want to do is you want to do your work. And that's why, going back to the beginning of this video, I think a lot of us in that situation where we just want to do our artwork. But unfortunately or fortunately, we do need to still realize that we're running a business and we need to take those steps to cover ourselves and make sure that we're taken seriously, that we're protected, and that there's less likeliness of us being screwed over in the first place. But at the same time, when things get to that point that you really have to go and do the hard yards to get paid on time and to get paid by your employer, that you have to hire a lawyer and do all these other things, is taking it to a whole new level. There's one guy I've hired multiple times. He's a friend of mine, but I had to sit him down the first time I ever brought him on for a very big Warhammer cinematic project. It was $1 million project, and there's a lot at stake. And to bring him on as an animator, it was tricky because he had sued one of his previous employers before. And originally, I'd heard about that before I even knew who he was. And I think we were at a bar one night, and that's when I realized that he was the guy who did that. And it was this hilarious story about how he had dressed up as Adolf Hitler and gone into this big studio, and he was marching around in character the entire day. There was Warner Brothers execs around. They were about to land a very big movie that I won't mention. And when they asked him, when they said, you know, what the hell are you doing? That's when he said, well, I'm just trying to fit in around here. And when you're hearing that for the first time, it's hilarious. It's like, wow, like, who does that? The fact that he took the bus to work that day in character, you know, the whole thing is just insane. But later when he told me the full story and he mentioned that he later sued them for wrongful dismissal and he won and he got a big payout from it, that's where I started to lose a bit of respect. I love the guy, but just that action never really meshed too well with me. But then later on, bringing him on for a project and then knowing the full context of how that all went down, like, he didn't really have any right to do that, okay? Like, it's offensive what he did and just so many other reasons around it. They had every right to fire him, especially given the fact that it was a sensitive time where the company was about to drastically change ownership over to being part of Warner Brothers and everything else going on. So for him to then sue them was really messed up. Now, for him to come on board with me, I doubt there would ever be any problems like that at all, but it was still something that I had to say to him, that you do not pull that crap here because I'm not going to put up with it. And on top of that, it's just not cool. So even though you have every right to sue someone in some situations, there are people out there who are suing for the wrong reasons. And that's why some studios might see you as a liability, because they don't know the full story. All they know is that by saying, come on board, we'd love to work with you, they could end up in court paying tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there's always going to be a bit of a taint to your reputation once you do something like this. So just keep that in mind, that that's the downside. That's the tricky area that you're going to navigate, is always having that reputation after you sue someone for something that maybe is just you standing up for your rights in the first place. So again, just something to keep in mind. Now, I want to recap everything that we've talked about really quickly. Again, I'd love to hear your comments. Leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are, what else you want to add to the conversation. So just really quickly, the best way to avoid being in the situation in the first place is to test the waters first. So screen your clients, communicate everything up front. Get them to agree in writing and have a gut check about whether or not you think that they're actually on the level. Get everyone to pay you incrementally, so that way if the damage is there, the damage isn't going to be so bad. Always be stern with them. If they miss a payment, tell them politely but directly that you're going to have to stop until you receive payment. Make sure everything is communicated over email. Send an email to recap any conversations that you've had over the phone, and get them to agree to everything in that email before you proceed. And figure out what works, like whether watermarking your work or whatever it is, ways to protect yourself until final payment, and then you can give final delivery of all the assets that you agree upon. But again, you do all this up front. Protect yourself. Don't assume the worst of your clients, but don't let yourself get taken advantage of either. Okay, I hope you found this valuable and I hope you got a lot from it. If you have something to add, leave your thoughts in the comments. If you can take a moment to share this with others, it would mean the world to me, so thank you. My big focus is to help artists make their art their business and to be able to level up their career and get the success that they deserve, as well as the opportunities and everything they can as a creative. And for you to be able to share this video with others and to help get that message out and to help others, that would be something that I would be forever grateful for. I take pride in reading and responding to everyone, and if you found this video valuable, let me know. Even a simple yes in the comments is enough to let me know that you want to see more in this area. And like I said, if you want to see more videos like this one, I will be releasing more videos every single week. So if you want to subscribe and get more of that, this could be your secret weapon. But either way, I hope you got a lot of value from this. And leave a comment, let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you would like to see next.